Let me say from Hawaii, aloha. And aloha is a word that we use that means a lot like namaste, that recognizes the beauty in every human spirit. And I come from a place that is remarkably beautiful. To be able to be in the audience here in India and have titans of industry and titans of the law to be able to give a presentation to is a remarkable opportunity, and I'm going to try to not overdo it and speak in within 15 minutes. So if I can, let's see, get started here. I would like to also especially give my aloha to Justice Swatanter Kumar, who is not only somebody that has been a guiding light for our Hawaii Supreme Court in terms of his jurisprudence, but he's also taught me how to dress, and you can see that we're looking very similar today. I hope people don't mix us up necessarily. And Moulika Arabhi also, for many years, she has been such a powerful mind in terms of understanding some of the most important environmental issues globally. So it's great to be with you. And Justice Lokur, you and I have been together before, and I'm a great admirer of the work that you've done in so many areas, so it's an honor to be with you. And as well, Professor Archna Negi, nice to see you. Well, let's get started on a bit of an adventure, if you will, from the point of view of Hawaii and this idea of climate justice. There's a word that hasn't been used, I don't know if it's been used yet in this conference, but it shapes jurisprudence in many parts of the world, and certainly in Hawaii, and that's the idea of an emergency. And I'm going to be speaking about that not with respect to just hand-wringing. You know, hand-wringing is where you talk about how there's an emergency but don't necessarily talk about solutions, because we're truly in a phase in Hawaii where we've got to focus on solutions. And these are some of the strategies that are being discussed. Strategic judicial application of the rule of law, you know, through, for example, environmental courts, declaration of a climate emergency, which has happened in Hawaii, and then going to scale. This is a grand issue, which might be a misleading concept that it'd be grand, but it's huge. And it has to be addressed at a large scale when it comes to damages. This is the Hawaiian Islands. We're the most remote landmass on Earth. And in the minds of the collective human consciousness, it may be that we are the ideal environment, but it is such a blessing to live there. This is one of the most iconic photographs in the world when it comes to the tropics, and this is Kalalau Valley, where I spent the most powerful moments, I think, in nature. It's a beautiful wilderness area on Kauai, and that beach will be gone in about 40 years because of sea level rise. These are treasures. I'm sure everybody, to a certain extent, is doing a thought experiment where they think, how could the earth have so many beautiful animals and plants? Well, these are some of the great treasures. Most of those in the slide will be gone in 40 or 50 years. Okay, so this is a dramatic slide that will give you an idea why it was exciting for me to fly to India, which is no question a critical part of the solution to protecting the earth, because the loss of $2 billion a year is what's pending when Waikiki Beach is washed away in about 40 years. And emergency. This is an emergency that I know in many ways the emergency maybe has been stated so many times that people have become numb. Not in Hawaii, because we are facing an existential threat, as are the nations of the world that are in the Pacific. And as you can see, the greenhouse gases now are at the highest levels in 400,000 years. And from a scientific point of view, where our greenhouse gas emissions have pushed Earth's ecosystems to their breaking point. This is language that's coming from the Hawaii State Legislature. Of course, it's based on scientific evidence, but when you have a legislature, a legislative body, make this kind of a legal declaration, it's an expression of the climate emergency that the citizens of Hawaii carry with them almost every day. It's not just the citizens of Hawaii. We do have one of the leading diplomats in the world that spoke recently at the COP just a couple months ago, where presumably solutions are supposed to be had for the global climate emergency. And his point, after speaking, he spoke at Columbia University last December about the fact that we're facing an emergency with the climate emergency that's worse than the pandemic. But here's what he said a couple months ago. I'm sure most of us in the room will remember this, but he says, "We are on a highway to climate hell with our foot still on the accelerator." If you're a judge, this helps make the point why, and you can ask yourself, you know, is there an issue that's the most important issues for judges in the world? Sometimes there is. And now there is. And you can see that it's climate change. Part of the reason is because the solution horizon is not very long. To be able to keep the Earth from heating up to 1.5 degrees means we have to act within a decade at the most. Where are we headed? We're headed to 2 degrees. So this is a data point that is a very penetrating one for some of the people in this audience. If you're 40 years old or younger, or you're from the final stand, the Jindal Global Law School has a contingent of students that are also part of the university that feel this and understand what's going to happen to their country if you have global warming to 2 degrees, which is where we're headed before the end of the century. The kind of migration that'll take place, you can see here that at 419 parts per million where we are now, we will be heading in the direction in which for India is likely to be, well, think about the reality of it. Ask yourself if this is destabilizing. Sir David King gave an address, which I was lucky enough to be part of in China. The Chinese government had a conference called Eco-Civilization Conference. He was the keynote speaker, and this is the data point that he used that I think I've heard it used again and again all over the world, but within 40 to 50 years, it's likely that 160 million people will be leaving Bangladesh. So when I know many of you might have been here when I gave my remarks, and I couldn't resist because we had the Solicitor General here, and I had a chance to ask him if Hawaii seceded from the Union, whether we could join with India. It was partly the idea that, you know, we are partners now. We're brothers and sisters. The degree of devastation, I mean, words are used all the time, dire consequences, existential threat is something that we share, because not all the world's on the front line of climate change, but Hawaii and India are. The whole world, though, at 2 degrees, this is now an often discussed concept among judges. This is a judge from the Supreme Court of New South Wales who's talking about how the rule of law that all of us in the room have devoted our lives to, all of us understand is maybe the most powerful tool for peace. The rule of law is likely to deteriorate to the point where it's not going to be nearly as applicable because political systems will be controlled much more by decision-making based on power. But this is what's happening all over the world, and it's certainly happening in Hawaii. This is an issue for the younger generation. The idea of an emergency is something that they're used to hearing. If you are at the highest levels of society and you are like the governor of the state of Hawaii, and I've heard the Prime Minister of India speak about the climate emergency in a way that is committed, but in Hawaii, our governor just asked for $100 million for climate change for his budget. This is what people that have true climate anxiety are really focused on. So there are 2 constituencies that are really stepping forward that, as Barack Obama would say, are necessary for transformational change to be able to protect you, if you're 40 years old or younger. And those 2 constituencies are young people. He said they have to get organized because the conventional governance systems like state legislatures, national systems such as Congresses, international systems such as the COP process aren't working. So young people have to get involved, which is part of the reason the final stand is here today. The second constituency are mothers. All around the world, mothers are getting organized because of the consequences to their children. It's already starting to become extremely evident. But this is really the community that's at stake, young people. And here's what they face. I'm about to speak about how much they face this political dynamic in the United States. So here are future generations on the left, and here are the leaders on the right. They are up against it, but there is no question that the movements that are taking place by brave lawyers in courts and by young people in legislatures and the legislative branches around the world are starting to make a difference. But they have to understand that they have to organize. They have to understand they're up against it. The chances of them being saved from a 2-degree world within the next 8 or 9 years, unless they can organize to get the attention of the leadership, to get the attention of the justices, according to Barack Obama, they don't have much of a chance. So this is, of course, part of the reason that India is the magnificent democracy that it is. Mahatma Gandhi is an inspiration to the Final Stand and to students in Hawaii too, because it gives them hope that although they're a small group with unquenchable faith, they can win. It's possible. And here they are. Greta Thunberg, who's often seen as sort of an eccentric and maybe overstates her issue. I mean, the issue she's stating is one that, is a fundamental one that she's been able to state now for young people that have organized as a consequence of her leadership. Whether that leadership's the best can be debated, but it's effective. And on the left is another young man that started a group called Extinction Rebellion that's using the law to be able to make the point in bringing lawsuits that younger generations are on the verge of extinction and the rule of law needs to be used to address the issue. So judges are not really looking at, if they look at the law, they're not necessarily, the science, which is an interesting role as a judge. We're put in a position where the proposition that we're not going to be able to make a difference, the chances are against it, it looks like we're not going to be able to keep the Earth from being 1.5 degrees, you can't have the changes that are necessary from the leadership in the energy industry to be able to get enough carbon out of the air. These are propositions that are legitimately discussed, but from a judge's point of view, if a case is proven that you have this injury that's about to be experienced, the judge can't engage in the idea that, well, it's not worth it because we're against the odds. The judge has to move to the remedy stage. And it is fascinating. The Global Judicial Institute and the environment has been formed under the United Nations so that judges can learn the science, consider the law, and hopefully apply it in a way that's not going to be too disruptive. One of the terms that's used, I think, when young people are trying to express the degree of concern that they have is that they are being disruptive. And I hope that we can consider much of it to be positive disruption. But again, for transformational change to take place, alluding again to the theme that Barack Obama has, maybe positive disruption is necessary. Oh my goodness, talk about positive disruption. This is like nuclear disruption all around the world. These are all cases in which courts have had to step forward to take action on climate issues, and they have. This is the most iconic case in the United States, the Juliana case, in which the right to a stable climate capable of supporting human life was decided, like the Urgenda case in the Netherlands, was decided in an Oregon district court. This is one of the statements made by the federal judge. Federal courts are too often have been cautious and overly deferential in the arena of environmental law, and the world has suffered for it. Well, that case was reversed, and the Supreme Court, in an unprecedented move, reached down to stop the case. A message to future generations. So these are students that were demonstrating on the steps of the United States Supreme Court. And this is an example of what's happening with the United States Supreme Court and the federal courts. When the case was reversed, there was a great dissent by a woman named Judge Staten. And you can see that as she characterized the majority's decision that there isn't such a right. Believe me, I'm quite confident that there is such a right in India, and quite confident there's such a right in France, and such a right for young people in Germany, and such a right for young people in Pakistan. Case law supports that. It's happening all over the world. But in the United States, as this judge whose her dissents become famous has said, the majority's decision is, it is as if an asteroid were barreling toward Earth and the government decided to shut down our only defenses. Seeking to quash this suit, the government bluntly insists that it has the absolute and unreviewable power to destroy the nation. In other words, in the United States, our federal courts are taking the position that for young people to go to court is a non-justiciable issue, and that they don't have standing because the remedies are too complicated. And this is the case recently from the United States Supreme Court. It is a case in which the court decided that the Environmental Protection Agency didn't really have the authority to regulate. So, again, if you're 40 years old and you hear this, 40 years old or younger, it's probably going to have impact, but the EPA didn't have the authority to regulate carbon emissions. And the decision of the majority was criticized by this great Justice Kagan, who wrote the decision, joined by Sotomayor, in which she called the decision frightening. That's a powerful word to be using in a dissent at the United States Supreme Court level. So, there is a tension. And I'll conclude by speaking about the level of tension in the United States on this, what might be considered to be the most important legal issue, whether or not there's access to the courts. In Hawaii, our Supreme Court has decided that there is a right, just as other courts such as India, it's had such a great influence on us, may well decide, and that is that there is a right to a stable climate capable of supporting human life. That's a decision that's been made by the Supreme Court of the state of Hawaii. I anticipate that many other state courts are going to be moving in that direction. So that tension that I'm describing is the difference between the way the federal courts are moving and the state courts. We also have an environmental court that was inspired by your Green Tribunal when Justice Kumar was in charge of the Green Tribunal. This is a justice who is famous for taking remedies to scale. The Brown versus Board of Education, when there was a decision made that the rights of young people to equal education were being violated, the U.S. Supreme Court back then in 1950s said that that was unconstitutional and ordered the desegregation of the schools, all the schools in the United States. So, what's my point here? The point is that the scale that can be taken on this emergency, that's the equivalent, is a scale that is extremely broad, and other courts are starting to apply at a scale that will address such things as whether there should be national subsidies of fossil fuel. The Karamatsu's case is an example of the power of the law because after during World War II, as you may know, the United States incarcerated all Japanese people. So it's a statement about how much potential there still is, while the rule of law is healthy, to be able to use the courts to create a remedy. So in conclusion, Justice Chandrachud, Justice Lokur, Justice Swatanter, Kumar, why do I mention their names? It's the human beings that are justices, that have courage and compassion, that can make a difference. And there's no more powerful court than the Supreme Court of India. And they came, the justices came to help us in Hawaii. And their presence in Hawaii is one of the reasons we have a powerful environmental court. One of the reasons why, as I say, our court just decided that there is a right to a stable climate capable of supporting human life. So we're on the road to solutions. We're on the road to a collaboration with young people, a collaboration with mothers, perhaps a collaboration with the leaders in different communities, whether you're talking about, I mean, this is an incredibly exciting organization, the International Law Section of the American Bar Association. Marissa, the representative from the the young adults, I guess you could say, is here. And I anticipate after speaking to Marcos that there'll be a great alignment now with the young lawyers in the United States and in India that are very interested in participating on this issue. This is at Jindal Global Law School. We have the members of the final stand there, along with a colleague of mine from the Supreme Court. So we've been fashioned to a certain extent by Dean Kumar, and Raj Kumar is something of a rock star in Hawaii, has met with, our justices and has conducted many conferences, and I've, followed him and admired him, and he's helped me pick out my suits. So I can't tell you how much difference he's made to me. And our schools, our partners, the law school, our law school at the University of Hawaii. Raj helped me find my favorite animal. Also, my friend Vaseline is in the audience along with our pal Stephen. I'm sorry to segue, but I'm in India. This is my favorite animal in the world. If you could protect the tiger, it would be incredibly important to the planet and those of us that care about biodiversity. So, in conclusion, I will thank all of you that continue to work on this quest to be able to keep the Earth from heating up to 1.5 degrees, but more importantly, to protect children and protect the tiger. And I can't explain just how much India has meant to me and my state, and this idea of seceding from the United States and becoming part of India. I do need to clarify, since I'm going to be going back to Hawaii, that I was just kidding. So, aloha and namaste.
Thank you, Justice Wilson. It's always great to hear your words. And you've having set the tone mainly with regard to climate action. You've spoken about various initiatives which are in the world taking place in various courts, and what is unfolding and what is the urgency. And I was hearing to the Chief Justice of India during the inaugural session of this conference, where he mentioned that we are reaching, in fact, the global melt and climate change is one of the reasons what is causing this global meltdown, and the action needs to be now. So we all understand that we have reached a phase of maybe speaking about climate change, but it's time now to talk about how to materialize and implement these climate actions, which I'm sure, in various courts, be it by the judges, many of the young adults, which Justice Wilson was just talking about, and even the final stand students from India. What is that action which is needed to make climate justice a possibility? Because, when we talk about climate justice, it is always human-centric. We think about those indigenous communities who are losing their land, but somewhere, coming from a conservation organization, WWF, for us the thought is also making and prioritizing environment while we talk about, inclusivity of humans. So somewhere from there, I would, I'm in the midst, for me it's personally an honor. I'm in the middle of my mentor, Justice Lokur, and Justice Swatanter Kumar, who is the reason for the development of environmental jurisprudence through the National Green Tribunal. So I personally attended a lot of the hearings where you've given us the nail-biting moments, be it the Nyamjangchu matter case, where the black-necked crane, there was this headline in the newspaper that the black-necked crane claims its space on the hydropower project. So these are some of the orders which gives a lot of hope when it comes to the climate action. So to begin with, I would like to ask Justice Lokur to also speak about, what can, on the name of, mainly for the climate justice, internationally and nationally, how can we achieve it, and what is the importance when we mainly mention about the climate justice?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Moulika. And thank you, Justice Wilson. That was really tone-setting. When we talk about climate justice or climate change, there's a definitional problem. To some people, climate justice means one thing. To some other people, climate justice means another thing. But I think there is unanimity on one issue definitely, which is that whatever is happening to the climate today is having an impact on the economy of countries. It's having an impact on the social interactions between people. And it's also having cultural implications. So it's really very, very wide-ranging. And it's a problem that is all over the world. I mean, you can see on the television every once in a while dramatic photographs of icebergs just crashing down in the Arctic. You can read about forest fires taking place in California and in other parts of the world. You can read about the heat wave that is in Delhi. I mean, spring has yet to come. Spring is supposed to come to Delhi next week, and we are already grappling with the heat wave. You've had flash floods in Malaysia just yesterday. So you name the continent. You've had droughts in Africa. You name the continent, and something or the other is going on. And unfortunately, we are contributing to it. In Latin America, for example, the Amazon forest is being denuded. It's more or less the same in India. There's a new definition of a forest. The result of this new definition of a forest is that many of the bungalows that you see in Lutyens, Delhi, are actually inside a forest. So, you know, these are things that are happening all across the world. I've spent a little bit of time in Fiji, and one of the problems that is being faced over there in the islands, in the small islands in the Indian Ocean, is the rising sea level. There are already plans to shift the people of some of these small islands, their countries by themselves, to Australia and maybe elsewhere because of the problems that are being faced due to climate change. Recently, Martha Nussbaum came out with a book, which unfortunately I've not yet had the occasion to read, but she says that animals also deserve human rights. Animals came on this planet before we did, you know, and we are creating a problem for them. And many of them, I mean, some of the species have already become extinct because of a variety of factors, including climate change. Marine life is being destroyed. I met an expert on the study of corals in Fiji, and he explained about the bleaching of corals, which is being caused by the rise in the temperature of the sea. One of the reasons for the rise in the temperature of the sea is the underwater volcanic explosion that took place near Tonga. And it had an impact all the way up to the Atlantic Ocean. So these are things that are happening. What is it that we can do? You see, the role of law, in my view, is somewhat limited. We can have legislation. There is already discussion about loss and damages that was taken up in COP27. So the role of law is there. I mean, I'm not discounting it at all. But I think there has to be this change in our mindset, in our political leaders, in our thought leaders, in our policy makers, that the environment is being destroyed. There is a huge impact of climate change. Millions and millions of dollars are being spent on, renovating places just because of floods. In India, you would have read about what is happening in Joshimath, not entirely due to climate change, but due to development. So earlier we used to talk about sustainable development, but now the word sustainable has gone out of the dictionary of development. So there are problems, and as Justice Wilson said, we have to recognize these problems. Once we recognize these problems, finding out solutions is possible. It is not that nobody's thinking about solutions, everybody's thinking about solutions, but how do you implement those solutions? How do you reach your goal? I think that is really the challenge. And I'm glad that a lot of young adults are taking an interest in this and are looking at the problem, because when we are talking about the impact of climate change, and when we are talking about climate justice, we are talking about something that's going to happen, say, maybe 10 years from now, 20 years from now. Perhaps by that time it'll be too late. Sustainable Development Goal, SDG 13, talks about climate action. And one of the reports that has come in is that by 2030, which is just 7 years from now, by 2030, 700 million people will be displaced. Why? Entirely because of climate change. So we have to find those solutions. Those solutions can come through a change in mindset, through understanding the problem, through recognizing the problem, and doing something about it. Discussions can take place, but really it's the implementation issue that I think is very important. That's all. Thank you.
Right, sir. So we can start climate action from this room itself. Can I request the organizers to put the temperature to 25 because it's really cold? So, going forward, sir, in NGT also, when we come, and then there are many cases which are heard, either with regard to the linear infrastructure, or it could be the faulty environmental clearances with regard to many of the projects which have been given a green signal because it has followed certain legal procedures. But then if we speak about the role of law, mainly so with regard to achieving or meeting or climate justice, or saying that climate justice is possible, what can we exactly do mainly in India, sir? And what role does law play in achieving climate justice for India?
Firstly, we wish all of you on the dais and of the dais good afternoon. See, climate change, to be seen in isolation, is the first human error. You cannot and you must not see climate change concepts dehorse the environmental journal issues. Ultimately, the end is impact on human life and our resources. Just to mention to you a little background, the Indian Constitution is one of the rarest constitutions in the world which gives you an environmental golden triangle. That is the constitutional duty on the citizens, constitutional duty on the state, and right to clean an environment as a fundamental right. Now there are three sources which we have: the legislature, the regulatory agencies, and the citizens. The responsibility is equal, if not more, on either of these segments. In my humble view, the climate change today is not only a major issue for the globe, but it is a threatening issue. The way Justice Lokur mentioned, Justice Michael mentioned, you can imagine these are just the work on the kind of a mentioning of the coming events. The rule of law is very significant, and it has a correlation as directly as that to the rule of law. If the rule of law is to be seen, it is what the judges speak through the law and what is the access to justice, that is the environmental justice. In our country, then, I would just mention one case to you, which just half an hour drive from here, and you can see what it was and what it is today. It is Sukhdev Bihar Resident Association case versus Government of India. Now, I don't know how many of you may be aware about it, that Delhi generates around about 1,620 metric tons of waste every day. Now, the emission from this waste-to-energy plant were the main concern, and the emissions were impacting day-to-day life, the temperature, and obviously that takes you to climate change aspect. Now, the residents wanted this plant to be shut. If you apply the theory of not my backyard, then obviously the result was to shut it. Question was, the 700 metric tons of waste that it treats every day, where will that go? Where will you dump that? Question was not only of waste, question was ultimately of emissions, because those emissions were causing variable environmental factors as well as the health of the public was being adversely affected. But by proper orders, proper data collection, proper technology, the plant could revive. Today it's functioning, and hopefully I think the residents are not facing that bad emissions. Thus, looking after the solution to the problems is the challenge today. In whatever field we talk about, whether in utilization of natural resources, whether deforestation or vehicular pollutions, emissions through fossil fuels, all of them put together causes a common human problem. All of them arise with the lifestyles. What I think is, besides proper administration of justice, that is, there should be greater emphasis by the courts on protecting the environment. We have, which shortly we may be discussing, we would be very concerned that the administration of justice in the environmental field must receive a higher value in our judicial system, not only in India, across the world. It should become a part of our education system. We must take precautions which we say is, I will do, not worry what others will do. Lastly, I would only say one thing, ladies and gentlemen, that we need nature for our existence. Nature does not need us for its existence. Therefore, what we really need to do is that plan properly, have proper data collection. There should be interchange of technology available for handling various human issues, which ultimately leads to gases and therefore variable temperatures. Now, what you are facing in Delhi now, Delhi was never used to what you are seeing it today. February used to be one of the most pleasant months in Delhi. So coming from that, it's a collective effort of all concerned. And as far as the laws in India are concerned, there are enough laws to protect the environment, because most of the legislation in India have come through their international commitment, not in independent legislative power. Once we are conscious, and what I put very normally is, it is the environmental consciousness. If we can bring that into our day-to-day life, protection of climate change would automatically follow. Because change in climate is not occurring because merely of one factor. It's a multifaceted attitude which is causing great concern today. There are effective judgments passed by the courts in India which definitely deal with not only the environmental aspects, stricto sensu, but even with climate change and climate justice system. So effective systems, good conscience, and complete bent of mind to protect the globe, not because environment doesn't care whether I am in India, Pakistan, US, UK, which part of the world. The air, if it goes through. Seas, if they are going to change their levels, it's going to change their levels. If we are not worried about the melting of glaciers, well, consequences are inevitable. So let's all hope that we avoid disasters and live a better life in this globe. Thank you.
Well said, sir. Nature doesn't need us, but we need nature. And pandemic has clearly shown us that when we were all shut in and we were under house arrest, naturally, we could see that the environment was clean. The places from where you could not see the mountains, you could see in your own houses, in your own gardens, you could see the birds, which you had not seen before. So definitely nature doesn't need us. It has a rebooting system. It'll reboot on its own. Taking the clue from what Justice Kumar just said, India, because we are a party to many of the international conventions. So Professor Archna, you being an academician and someone who's following the trends closely, how hopeful are you of these international trends leading to climate justice?
Well, thank you so much, Moulika. I prefer to stand so that I can see everyone. Firstly, thank you for staying. I realize I'm speaking after 3 honorable justices. I am the least honorable person on this panel, but I'm certainly very honored to be here and to place my views. So it was absolutely wonderful to hear what has already been said, and thank you, ABA, for this. So I'm from JNU, the Jawaharlal Nehru University, and I pursue international law and also environmental negotiations, climate in particular. And I thought I'd quickly grab this opportunity to do 2 things. One is to tease out the concept a little bit more of climate justice, and then to basically point at some of the recent developments that are taking place at the international level, where the world is heading in terms of some of the recent developments. So when we talk about current developments in the context of international law and climate change, there are, of course, this can be broken down into several, but since I was given 5 minutes, I've broken it down into 5. And the first is, of course, the developments in the climate negotiations. And this is the most visible part of what's happening in international law, because Sharm el-Sheikh and Glasgow before that and Paris before that, all of that is followed by the public media, etc. And sometimes we have wins and sometimes we have losses in the context of climate negotiations. Issues of equity and differentiated responsibilities have been very core to the way in which these negotiations have developed. And if you go back into that history, which I'm not going to do today, you find this very interesting, the troughs and the crests of the movement. A second equally important sort of development is the current developments around climate negotiations outside of the formal track of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And as you mentioned, this cannot be something that is, it must be viewed more holistically. So there are things happening outside of the UNFCCC framework as well. A third development is that of the legal principles that are developing, whether it is that of differentiated responsibilities and equity, or whether it is the most important legal principle of intergenerational equity, which is very core to the climate issue. Fourth sort of development is that of the scientific inputs. This doesn't strictly come from the legal fraternity, as it were. It comes from all of the international institutions that are following where the climate story is going. So I'm referring here to all of the IPCC reports, all of the reports from IEA, from UN Environment, etc., which are directly feeding into the developments in international law. And last and most interesting are the developments in climate litigation, which is signified by the term turning to the courts. So broadly speaking, these are the developments that I'd like to focus upon very, very briefly. But before I go there, I just want to take a minute to go into the concept of climate justice and to kind of point out that the very core idea of climate justice begins with the acknowledgement that the adverse impacts and implications of this phenomena, which has been eloquently talked about before, are not going to be felt equitably amongst states, amongst communities, amongst individuals as well. So whether it is extreme events, whether it is rising sea levels, the effects of climate change will have disproportionate effects on marginalized communities and on unempowered individuals, on weaker states, on poorer states, etc. Additionally, those who are most vulnerable to climate change also have disproportionately low responsibility in causing the problem itself. So that is another aspect of it. So one of the important things to sort of remember is that when we talk about climate impacts, we usually discuss the context of the physical phenomena, sea level rise or extreme weather events, but it is equally important to see that there can be a serious climate impact in exacerbating inequitable social conditions that already exist. And that is very, very core to the idea of climate justice. So climate justice is a term, but it's also a movement, it's also a rallying call. And I just want to highlight this fact that while it is important to note, it is extremely important to note that there is a dual objective which is embedded in the notion of climate justice. It is important, of course, to address the phenomena of climate change and to control and regulate climate change. But it's equally imperative to ensure that equity and fairness in the processes and outcomes of the action taken to control climate change are ensured. So climate justice in that sense, from an international law perspective, is bringing together all of the principles and all of the developments in international environmental law and marrying them to the international human rights law that already exists. So what we see today is a whole lot of this coming together of these two fields of law. So very quickly, let me skip climate negotiations. We don't have the time for that, but that's perhaps the one which is most ardently followed in any case. Some of the interesting developments around, I will just point to. So it's not just within the UNFCCC. There are some very interesting, for example, last summer, there was a General Assembly resolution that was adopted which clearly talks about affirming the right to an environment, a human right to an environment. This is built around and accompanied by a whole lot of resolutions that have come out from the Human Rights Council. So if you look back at the 15 years of work of the Human Rights Council, they explicitly address issues of environment and human rights, but also climate and human rights. And they break it down to vulnerable groups. They talk about the vulnerability, for example, of children, of older people, etc., to issues of climate change. And there's a rich body of resolutions that you can find there. The Security Council is a different story. Right? In December 2021, the attempt to link climate change to security did not work. Okay, I'm already getting an indication, so let me come down to the three basic points. One of the recent developments, which is very interesting, and especially for the students who are here, the law students who are here who can follow up, is this whole idea of turning to seek advice. So whereas the climate negotiations are looking at the praxis of climate change, there is also this effort to look for normative development of climate change. And there are three advisory opinions that have been sought from three different courts and tribunals. The first is from the International Tribunal of the Law of the Seas. That has been submitted last year in December. The second is in the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, which has been submitted this January. And most interestingly, the ongoing multilateral effort to take forward to the International Court of Justice the question of state obligations in the context of human rights. Now, there are fascinating stories within each of these, but I don't have the time to pursue them at the moment. I will stop by just saying three different tribunals are dealing with this question of what exactly are state obligations in the context of climate change, and what is going to happen when they do not meet their international legal obligations relating to climate protection. All three are built around, very strongly around the notion of climate justice because they come from the small island states. Vanuatu is heading this movement, taking it forward to ICJ. If the UN General Assembly approves this at the end of this month, then it will go to the International Court of Justice and we'll have to wait and see. Are international ICJ advisory opinions binding? No, they're not, but there are various ways in which they're going to feed into the other ongoing processes in online tracks. So this is something to look at and follow. Thank you very much. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Professor Archna. I'm sure to capture all the international trends in 5 minutes is not, it's not climate justice, leave alone there is injustice here, speaking about climate. So going forward in terms of, taking and capturing the discussion you've all said till now, somewhere there is this message coming out that what is needed, especially to achieve climate justice, is also human action. And that action which will then lead into somewhere sustainable development. Somehow I'm not in favor of this word sustainable development because I haven't seen it happening ever. That we are developing in a sustained manner. But taking, in case if we have to take the discussions forward, what lifestyle changes are needed to, by humans to make climate justice and to achieve climate justice? And first of all, is it possible?
Yeah, thank you, Moulika. Changes are taking place right now as we speak. One is, we've always had this problem of the use of fossil fuels. Now, India is, in a sense, leading the charge, so to speak, in the use of solar energy. Right? Wind energy also is being utilized in India and in several other places. In the United States, the number of electric vehicles, whether they are cars or whether they are buses, has seen a phenomenal increase in the last couple of years. So these kind of changes, they are taking place. The only thing is that, as the Secretary General of the United Nations said, Mr. Antonio Guterres, that we have, our foot is on the accelerator on the highway to hell. I think we have to put our foot on the accelerator to increase the pace of these developments. These developments, like I said, they are taking place. Archna had referred to the initiative taken by Vanuatu. Vanuatu is a very small island somewhere in the Pacific Ocean, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. They are facing the rise in sea levels, as in our neighborhood, the Maldives are facing the rise in sea levels. Many of the islands are expecting to go underwater in the next maybe couple of decades, not in the next 2 or 3 years, but in the next couple of decades. Plans have already been initiated on how to save the lives of people in these islands. Vanuatu has taken the lead in bringing up this issue and is wanting to refer it for the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice. Now, as Archna said, it's not a binding decision that would be given, it's only an advisory opinion. But it can bring about a difference. I had mentioned in my opening statement about the issues of loss and damages, which was discussed in COP27. Who pays for it, right? Now, these are issues which Vanuatu is going to raise before the International Court of Justice once the matter goes there. What can we do to stop this damage to the climate? And who is going to pay for the damage that has already been caused? Disproportionate burden is being felt by the poorer nations, whether it's in Africa or whether it's in Asia. Who's going to pay for it, right? Where's the money? Where's the fund? So these are all actions which I think we as people who are impacted need to take before we can even think of, moving forward. I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Yes, definitely. And also this brings us to the need of having environmental lawyers. So if these actions needs to be taken, and I'm sure majority here are lawyers, and being an environmental lawyer myself, we always start this conversation that we have only countable environmental lawyers. But say in case if climate litigation is the future, so are we prepared, sir? Are we prepared to have the climate litigation well implemented, and do we have lawyers who can actually take up these cases and defend both human rights and more against our environment?
See, as far as institutions are concerned, I mentioned a little bit earlier, you have the Supreme Court, where you can invoke all environmental jurisdiction as well as the climate change justice. Then you have the high courts, and in our country, the Supreme Court and all high courts have been very progressive on climate concerns or the environmental concerns. And they have expanded the law, which normally people have wrongly terminated as judicial activism or judicial overreach. But I think the courts in India have contributed very, very constructively to the upcoming structure of litigation as well as the bar. National Green Tribunal did its bit, whatever it was, and I'm happy to say they had a huge bar of environmental lawyers. So it is not something, a subject comes in, so we have enough remedies available under the NGT Act, under the Constitution itself, under Article 21, and more so even under Criminal Procedure Code for a nuisance offense. So the lawyers today are technically sound, and once you introduce these topics at the school and the college levels, and some universities have taken a decision that environment would be taught across the discipline. I think it's a very encouraging thing, and they must teach. Once the students will come after learning the environment as a subject at different levels, their outlook when they enter into the profession would be definitely very better than what it is. But today, I think the members of the bar are fully mentally and technically equipped to handle the climate change cases. And today, the interaction between different bars, including the international bar, is so much that, there is a thought process we can learn from each other in terms of law, in terms of how to apply law, and how to sustain law. So sustainability is not only applicable to environment, it is equally applicable to law also. Law, when you talk about, and I think the climate litigation in India is going to rise very rapidly, because now we are really touching on our natural assets to a difficult situation. And therefore, things will be the day-to-day need, population going up. You have to check everything if we want. And I'm sure that the advocates' approach to climate change justice would be very positive. And I think the courts in India are sufficiently equipped, I think, that they can handle these cases. So there is no dearth of law, no dearth of lawyers, no dearth of institutions to handle. Thank you.
That gives a lot of optimism, sir. So Justice Wilson, you can quote many of the climate cases in future presentations coming from the courts of India. So to conclude, because the timer shows its time up, but then I would request each of the panelists to just comment on, one thing, and there are young lawyers here, that is climate just future possible? Can we achieve what we are targeting to achieve?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I'm an optimist, and I think we can achieve it. Internationally, you saw the photograph of Greta Thunberg. She's just a teenager. So it's really for the young people to rise to the occasion and make sure that we get climate justice. It's not only a question of our survival. It's also a question of the survival of the entire species of animals, humans, marine life, just about everything. So if you are able to rise to the occasion, and I should think that young lawyers are capable of doing it, youngsters are capable of doing it, you're going to effectively save the planet. Thank you.
Yeah, so very quickly, I would like to say the following. One, that climate change is one issue area where power asymmetries don't work in the usual sense. In the sense that those who are weak and vulnerable acquire a moral weight to take forward movements, to take forward and to actually achieve things. This is there in international law because you see the small island developing states, acquiring a larger space than their power actually allows them so they swing above their weight, as they say. So the vulnerable are playing a very, very big role in taking forward this whole story of climate justice. A lot of the climate litigation that we unfortunately could not discuss today have originated from vulnerable groups. There's a fascinating case in the European Court of Human Rights where a group of women above 60 have gone to the European Court of Human Rights and saying that climate change is interrupting and our right to life, etc. And similarly, college students, young teenagers have been going to the courts. I see that we are on the brink of a tsunami of climate litigation. So in the coming 2 years, tsunami I shouldn't say, given that climate doesn't look favorably at it, but there are a huge lot of pending litigations, both at the regional courts, in Europe, etc., and at the domestic level in the national courts, etc. So there's a lot to move forward, and I'm not such an optimist as far as direct action is concerned. Changing lifestyles to change the climate may not work as well, but using individual strength to work the systems, right? Whether it is the courts at all possible levels, is surely something that can work for climate justice. So I'll just stop by saying both things have to be focused upon. One is to bring down climate change and deal with the natural phenomena, but also to look at the issues of equity in the processes, right? How are people, because we're going to live with this for a long time. We've just crossed 30 years. If you take 92 as the starting point with the UNFCCC, climate action will continue for the long time, so it may as well be equitable and just and fair. Thank you, Moulika.
I would only say that climate change actions have to be more founded on precautionary principle rather than sustainable development. Because there are only two factors which can save us: environmental consciousness, then the doctrine of public trust, and precautionary principle. If these three we combine together and think what we are doing in all fields of life, probably we'll be able to help this temperature coming down, or at least stabilizing at a point. Otherwise, the results are not very difficult to see. So what we have to do really is that whether it is bar, bench, the citizens, or everybody, we have to take care that we respect the environment, the nature and the natural resources, and protect them and not leave them for others to do for us. That's all I could say. Thank you.
Okay. Well, this is a great question. I mean, how is it possible to achieve climate justice and the environment that we're in globally? Especially, again, if you look at the age composition. The word that I would use that I haven't used here that I think captures a lot of the approach of young people is survival. So when you consider climate justice and what that looks like, and if the issue is that serious, it makes sense that everything would be done, litigation's one, but everything would be done to try to get the attention of the true leaders of our communities. You know, there are record profits that were made by energy companies in the last year. There's an enormous amount of wealth creation in the global economy. This is a conference of those that understand the economy. Some of the best lawyers in the world that know the capital markets. So a fast track to being able to get climate justice is to provide a pathway for the capital. And sometimes that can be done by legislation. For example, in California, where they passed a law that said no more fossil fuel cars can be sold after 2030, that opened up the big market. It can also be done through economic incentives where it's worth investing in hydrogen. It's worth investing in solutions that could maybe give us a remarkable alternative in terms of energy. But that's the concept of political participation of young people, that because if you think about what is the constituency that has the most power politically on earth? Children, young people. They're the ones that are at stake. So the idea that an ESG, let's say a socially responsible investment fund, is put together that is seen realistically by the markets as leading to a climate solution. There's no solution right now, right? In this dialogue with judges or with young people, eventually the question comes up, what is the plan? What is the solution? To what extent should we be going to geoengineering? To what extent should we be going to stopping the rainforest? But if you have an ESG or you have an investment interest, that means that there will be a rate of return that's somewhat guaranteed by government intervention or lowering the risk, you can move capital to put these plans together that the COP process hasn't been able to, a global plan that India can invest in. So my suggestion is that we can do this, but it's got to be done at a very global level, and it's got to be done with the participation of leaders outside of just the legal community. We've got some good legal principles, but the movement of capital is really important, and that's something that can be influenced as well by organizing it at the level of young people being in the political process and being willing to work with that community that's doing so well from the fossil fuel, the energy industry. Thanks.
Thank you, Justice Wilson. So it is clear, as the conference theme itself says, that let us learn from the global best practices and implement it locally, and climate justice is definitely possible. I'm hopeful. Thank you, Justice Wilson, Justice Kumar, Justice Lokur, and Professor Archna for being on the panel today. It was truly overwhelming and nice to gather a few more thoughts for future. Thank you.